My name is Monica Randall, and I'm, just a local historian. And as you know, this is the 100th anniversary of F. Scott Fitzgerald's great book, The Great Gatsby, which he started writing right up the road. He lived here. He was renting a mansion, excuse me, at 6 Gateway Drive, during the 20s. And I'm going to show you, hopefully, some of the crazy things that were going on during that era. I mean, it's so mind-boggling because originally, my folks were from a little farm in Pennsylvania, and then my mom came here and she became a governess on several of the estates. So we go from this little farm, and suddenly we're on the Gold Coast where my sister and I, we rode horses. We would ride the neighbors, we would borrow the neighbors' horses, and we would wander around. I'm talking about the 50s, and it would be one mansion after another. I mean, there were supposedly over 600, and I'm counting only houses over 40 rooms. 20 rooms was iffy, but 40 rooms. Some of them had 2,000 acres. Marshall Field out in Lloyd Neck. Uh, and I used to have to pinch myself. Is this real? What planet are we on? It was so staggering. And the beauty, even these places that had been abandoned for years, falling apart, engulfed in ruins. I thought ruins were the most beautiful thing in the world. I used to just obsessively paint, the Gold Coast ruins, which I should maybe display some of them at some point. But what baffles me is that to this day, his book, The Great Gatsby, is still listed as a work of fiction. And it's all true. Every character in that book is a real person. There was a J. Gatsby. His real name was Max Gerlich. Meyer Wolfsheim was Arnold Rothstein, real gangster who used to use human molars as teeth. Daisy was Fitzgerald's wife. Daisy was actually Zelda. And in 23, she did, while driving drunk, and believe it or not, this is baffling, it was legal to drive when you were drunk in the 20s. They hadn't made a law yet, and most Model T Fords, they only went about 25 miles an hour. But she ran over a woman while drunk in Great Neck. She didn't kill her. That was a little fictionalized. She broke her shoulder. Even that was true. Myrtle Wilson, in the book and of course the movie. And who am I leaving out? Yeah, so Gatsby's real name was Max Gerlich, and all the books that have been written about F. Scott Fitzgerald, I sometimes wonder, there's a lot of conflicting information about his background. He's definitely from Minnesota. One book says he was born in 1898, another one says 1896. Some books say that he came from a wealthy family, but according to the documentary on the History Channel, his father, it was very vague what his father did, could never hold a job. So even though they lived in nice homes in Minnesota and he got a very good education, Fitzgerald went to Princeton. You had to have connections and money, certain privileges to get into a college like that. But even then, he drank. But it may have been the mom that had the money. And with his wife, Daisy and Zelda, Zelda did come from a wealthy family in Alabama. I forget what her parents did, but so she grew up in this privileged life, and he did not. But he had heard about the Gold Coast. This was it. This was the place where it was all happening. Yes, you had Newport, Rhode Island, the Gilded Age. It was a different era. They were a little bit more stuffy, very exacting in their ways. But the Gold Coast was wild. You could write a novel. You could make a movie about almost every house. The murders, the scandals. They're still finding bodies in the basement. I was living in the Woolworth mansion temporarily, and they found a dead body, a skeleton actually, and 1959. They don't know who it was. I mean, it's really, really crazy, crazy stories. I meant to bring a copy of my book, but it's out in the car. So what I'm going to do is touch on or try what, the overall, what it was like to live here on the Gold Coast if you were, indeed a very wealthy, privileged person in the parties. I hope I'm not leaving anything out. I have notes, but I never look at them. So, also, something else that I always forget to mention, Hollywood didn't exist yet. Hollywood came later. So all movies, the movies from the silent film era, they were all being filmed right here on Long Island, mostly Astoria, Queens. So you had the Marx Brothers and W.C. Fields, Rudolph Valentino, I'm trying to think, Charlie Chapman, even Ring Lardner from Ringling Brothers Circus, so W.C. Fields, Eddie Cantor. All of these famous people during that era had mansions right here in Sands Point and Great Neck. So, of course, whenever there was a party, they were invited. So you always had celebrities at all of these events. So we have to make the room really dark so we can see these images. Now, some of the images I found, archival, wherever I could. This came out of a book about his life. Now, Fitzgerald is a very handsome fellow. Now, he wasn't that tall, but he was athletic. He played football when he was in college. He did have to drop out of Princeton because, he had a drinking problem, which is ultimately what killed him. He was only 40 years old when he died, or 41. Very sad. So here he is, right here in, actually it was Great Neck at 6 Gateway Drive. And he's in this little room. He had to have peace and quiet because they had a lot of dogs. And he, needed quiet and, not be interrupted. Those of you who are writers, you know that. So he had this little room above the garage. And everyone back then usually had a one-car garage. And I don't know if I mentioned a Model T Ford, which is the big thing, starting around 1909. A Model T Ford would cost back then about $500. So that was a big chunk of money back then. But Fitzgerald liked to, I don't want to put on airs, whatever. And he managed to buy a yellow Rolls Royce. So if you saw the movie in 1974 with Robert Redford, he's driving a yellow Rolls Royce, which is true, he really did. But he bought it from, a garage. It had been in an accident, and the passenger side of the car was all smashed in. So he pays $200 for it, and whenever he went to a fancy party, he made sure he drove it so that you only saw the good side of the yellow Rolls Royce. That's something I would do, and they wouldn't see, you'd park in a bunch of bushes, and you wouldn't see that was all. That's why he got it for $200, because I'm sure they were very expensive even then. So here he is, focusing on capturing the spirit and the mood of that extraordinary era, which, went right through, the prohibition, a stupid law. I mean, more people died from that idiotic law. They say that people who never drank in their lives were suddenly drinking. It's human nature. If you tell people you can't do this, of course you're going to do it. So when he and Zelda over in their mansion with the Courtesy Bay, when they went and they walked their dog down on the beach, this is what they would see from Great Neck. And he would look at this and just totally flabbergasted. What is this? They didn't have anything like that in Minnesota. So he describes it on page 5. He describes it architecturally. There's no question that he is talking about this very real mansion. It was called Beacon Towers. It's on the flyer, that beautiful flyer that Jeff made. There was a Gatsby mansion, according to Fitzgerald's vision. So he describes it as a 15th century feudal castle with crenellated towers and conical shaped turrets. So nothing else. I mean, Fillet is a little bit of kind of a modest version of this. But in fact, this was not built by J. Gatsby with new money. This was built by a woman, Alva Vanderbilt, who I believe she was the granddaughter of Commodore Vanderbilt. They were first in the shipping lines and then railroads and steel and on and on and on. Bazillionaires, along with the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and the Astors and the J.P. Morgans. So she built this incredible castle right on the water. And unfortunately, along with at least 500 other places, once you had, people always say, what happened? Why did they tear all these incredible buildings down? They didn't do that up in Newport. They didn't tear anything down. They didn't tear anything down on the Hudson River, because I spent years documenting those castles. They would rather starve. They would, on the Hudson River, the Astors, they'll kill me if they knew I said that. They had no money, but the house was worth millions, 800 acres on the Hudson River. They had no money. They would drive around and they would pick up roadkill. And if they found a dead raccoon, I'm not kidding, I was there, I saw it. They saw a dead raccoon on the road. They'd take it home and make a stew out of it. That's how they survived. It's a little too weird for me, but that they had a different attitude. They would not sell out for money, which is, what they did here to the developers. So this was built by Alva Vanderbilt, who was married a couple times, August Belmont, and she was very much involved in the women's suffragette movement. And when she organized a lot of her wealthy friends, the wives of all these men, women got the vote in New York State in 1917, and everyone else had to wait until, I think, 1920 to get the vote. So she was always promoting, the strength of women, and women were pretty passive back then. So throughout the house, she had these life-size statues of Joan of Arc and murals of Joan of Arc charging off on a horse with a sword and, armored, suits and everything. It's kind of a fantasy. And she threw very, very fancy parties at this house. So unfortunately, 1929, October 1929, the stock market crash pretty much wiped out 90% of it. This is why these places went down. First, the stock market crash, where a lot of millionaires lost millions in 1 hour. Then you had the Great Depression, and then you had Pearl Harbor, it was 1941, and we get into World War II, and all the able-bodied men, and it took hundreds of men to keep these estates going. Not just the gardeners, take care of the horses, take care of the cars, fixing the roof, blah, blah, blah. The average estate, I know at Harbor Hill, they had 125 people, men, mostly men, maintaining these places. So they were all drafted, for the war. So, and plus you don't want to have a war. You don't want to be using these places to have fancy parties when people are dying. Your uncles and your fathers and your brothers are dying in the war. I know we lost a number of family members in that war. So it's unseemly to be having fancy parties, at a time like that. So that was the end. And they just started bulldozing them. And a couple of them, now this one survived. I'm sure you all know this. You probably know more about this than I do. This is called Land's End. It was originally built, I believe, by Bayard Schroep, who was a newspaper publisher, I think the New York Herald, I think. You know, he was sort of like a William Randolph Hearst kind of person. Now, this is a little bit more modest, or it's a little more subdued. It's very Southern, you know, Palladian, antebellum kind of a house, but it's not trying to be something it's not. You know, like Beacon Towers, which was the last house, Alva Vanderbilt's house, that was trying to be, you know, which is fine with me. I thought it was great. But this, because this represented Daisy Buchanan's house, and she came from old money, they didn't feel they had to prove anything. They didn't have to, you know, knock people over like, oh, wowie, wow. They knew who they were, and so it's not, I mean, it's big. It had 82 rooms, and it was right on the water. And this mansion was in mint condition, because, you know, I worked in the movie industry. We filmed here all the time. And right up until maybe 15, 20 years ago, it was in good shape. And then I guess somebody decided, because it was on the water and it had a dock, it had a helicopter pad, it was on and on. It was a fabulous swimming pool. It was decided that the land was worth more than the house. And when they tore this down, it was really, really heartbreaking, because there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, the other ones were disintegrating, you know, for years. The ceilings, you know, were coming down. And so my little sister and I, we come along, I was, you know, like 10, 12 years old, and we made friends with our wealthy neighbors who had all these beautiful horses. They had 14 horses. And they were now in their 80s, and they said, oh, we're too old, we can't exercise the horses. Take any horse you want, exercise them, they need a workout. And it didn't take us long to discover that we were in this phantasmagorical world of endless, you know, grandeur. So we would, in the morning, we would, you know, pack a little picnic, and if you galloped along the shore, you could pretty much gain access to almost anything. And by the way, how many of you ride horses? Right. If people think I make these things up, I don't. I make bets. Anyone who thinks I make something up, I'll make you a bet. There is a law that's still in the books. It's called right-of-way privilege. You know about that. If you are on a horse and you're trespassing on anybody's estate, it is perfectly legal, but you have to have that right look. You have to look like Ralph Lauren-ish. You know, if you were riding around on a Western getup, you'd probably be shot, and I could understand that. But you had to, you know, you had to have that English, you know, that proper look. But we knew about that, because our neighbors, they said, oh, no, you could go anywhere you want, and no one is going to say anything. And that went back to 1986, when the Meadowbrook Hunt Club first started. They were based out of the Meadowbrook Club in Jericho. And they would, you know, imitate the English way of life. And so if they were chasing a fox, they're not going to go and knock on J.P. Morgan's door and say, oh, please, do you mind if I trample through your rose garden? We're chasing Mr. Fox, and he came through. You know, no, they said, okay. It was usually in the fall. All fox hunting was in the fall, and the roses had already, you know, done their thing. So if you trample, everything would come back. I know they came through our property lots of times. So that's where that rule came. So we knew that. And, today, I know that the police don't know that. Most people don't know that. You could get shot. But anyway, not if you're dressed like Ralph Lauren. But so anyway, it was a very exciting. It was just an absolute fantasy. We felt like we were living in a movie. So about as far as we could go in the course of a day was maybe Glen Cove, say from Oyster Bay to Glen Cove. It could take hours to get in the Glen Cove area, where all the Pratt mansions, J.P. Morgan's house, you know, his yacht, the Corsair, you know, it was very typical that some of these yachts, if the house was on the water, it had a yacht. And I remember even as a kid in the 50s seeing some of these yachts. They were, like the Corsair was 350 feet long. And there was another yacht called the Savarona. It's a private boat. And that was 410 feet long. It slept 60. 410. That's half the size of the Titanic. What was the Titanic? It was 880 feet, I think. Yeah. A private boat, 410 feet. So this scale, it's just, and it's still around. That boat, you can, I think it's in Tangiers. You can actually rent it for for $50,000 a day. You can rent the Savarona, so it's in good shape. So anyway, so one day, it's now maybe 1962, and we're wandering around, and we came upon Pembroke. Now, this is a typical Gold Coast mansion, but extraordinary. Probably the most extraordinary. I mean, this makes Old Westbury Gardens and Planting Fields look ho-hum. I mean, they're beautiful. They'll kill me for saying that. But there were places that existed at the time. I mean, look at this thing. It had a palm conservatory that covered an acre in land, and it was filled with hundreds of tropical birds, parrots and cockatoos and minor birds, weird birds that spoke, foreign languages. Now, when this was taken, I actually chartered a private plane from Zahn's Airport. It was like really cheap. For $50, you could charter your own private plane with a pilot. They would take the door off, and I would be dangling, lying on the floor, strapped in with a Rolleiflex camera, and then the Nikon, for color. And I shot this. You were only allowed to go up to 1,000 feet, or within 1,000 feet. You weren't allowed to get any closer. But, with a zoom lens, you could pretty much capture it. So I see this thing, and I'm going, oh, my God. So when I got back down on land, I drove over there, and I made friends with the caretaker, who was very friendly. He grew up there. His father had been a caretaker prior to him, and he lived, right on the property. And oh, my God, did he have stories? And they were real. He was talking about gangsters and prohibition and shootouts and bodies in the tunnels and so on. Lots of movie stars had stayed here. So this was built by Captain Delamar, an old sea captain who, back in the 1800s, his family was traveling around the world, and their ship was caught in a storm, and the ship, I don't know the name of it, it sank. And this little boy survived by holding on to a wooden door, and these Mediterranean fishermen found him. He was half dead. He didn't know who he was. He didn't know, I don't even know if he could talk. I think he was like 4 years old. And they raised him, and they gave him the name Delamar, which in Italian, of course, means from the sea, Captain Delamar. And they taught him how to salvage gold from shipwrecks. Apparently, that was a common thing back then. I don't know if any of that still exists. So he becomes a bazillionaire, and he comes to Glen Cove, because this was the place to be, 1914, and he builds this incredible estate. It's almost 100 acres, well, 89 acres, called Pembroke. And it was amazing. That this is just the house. The house alone was 86 rooms. Now, when I was using the Rolleiflex, which is a square, those of you who are photographers, 2.25 square, but I only had a 50mm lens. I couldn't even, the house was so big. You can't get the entire house in the camera. You can only get it really from a plane. And so you could see the scale. Plus, it had an indoor tennis court and stables for like, I think, 14 horses. And you see the conservatory with all these palm trees. You know, I started painting this as a ruin. I was going to bring copies of the paintings, but this program's just too long as it is. Now, the lower level, which is covered with ivy, is actually a movie theater that goes down another 20 feet, and it was done on the style of Radio City Music Hall, which hadn't been built yet. That wasn't built until 1932, Radio City. But they had one beforehand. It had all velvet seats and gilded, boiserie on the walls and murals of the silent film era. And it held 600 seats so that they could show the silent films, to their guests. So it was all very exciting. And then unfortunately, when Captain Delamar died, it was purchased by Marcus Lowe, who owned the Lowe Theaters. He not only owned the studios, because now they've gone to Hollywood, but he owned all the theaters. So he had a lot of money to keep this up. And in the course of his reign, everybody, Grace Kelly, Clark Gable, Cary Grant, even Liz Taylor and Richard Burton had stayed here when they got married. After she made Cleopatra, they got married, and even though they were both married to other people. And so the press was following them, and the Lowes said, "Come stay at Pembroke. The press will never find you." It's practically on an island. And they never did. They had privacy. I think that was, the 60s maybe? I don't know. And then ultimately, this is what happens, when there's no heat and water, is leaking in the ceiling. And here you have a typical dock. All these houses on the water had to have a 300-foot dock. This one was made out of granite blocks. Same stuff they used to build the Brooklyn Bridge. So this one survived. A lot of them didn't. The wooden ones, I don't think there's any left of the wooden ones. So they had to have 300-foot docks because that's how big the boats were. And then you had to allow for high tide and low tide. I don't know what the difference is. I'm not a boat person. I think it's 12 feet between high tide and low tide. And an interesting point, when Fitzgerald wrote in his book, and he's all mooey-eyed over Daisy and hoping that she comes to one of his parties. And he focuses a lot on this flashing green light. Well, because he was from Minnesota, and he didn't know the little quirky ways and protocols of the North Shore, he never realized that flashing green light meant that it was high tide. And if you had a 400-foot yacht, it was safe to come into the harbor. But if it was a flashing red light, which he didn't even know existed, it meant it's low tide and your boat, the hull, is going to get smashed to smithereens. If you want to go swimming right now, the rocks, you can't swim when it's low tide. I tried yesterday. It's 100 degrees, but if it's low tide, forget it. It's slimy. You have to walk to Connecticut before you're in over your head. But that was that one little thing that he didn't know. But that green light, meant high tide. Otherwise, you'd have to put your yacht way out in the Long Island Sound and then take a launch to your house. And so this is a small boat. This is a CKG Billings boat. I do remember seeing these boats. They were still around. A lot of them were lost during the Second World War. They would donate I think J.P. Morgan donated his boat for the war effort. They turned it into a battleship, and they ended up being sunk. But just to show you how fancy the guest rooms were, it was like the Titanic, the Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette furnishings and English furnishings is all very, very lavish. So one day, I didn't know this was going to happen. There were always rumors, but I didn't know. I drove over to Pembroke. I nearly had a heart attack. They were ripping it, to pieces, with the ball and chain. I was really, I just thought of them as my own personal little playhouse. And I would wear black for a week. I mean, it was really heartbreaking to see this hundreds and hundreds of times. And so here we have another winner. This is probably the most extraordinary, one of the largest. Well, technically, it was the second largest house in the country. I think Biltmore in North Carolina, one of the Vanderbilt places, has 250 rooms. This only had 136 rooms. So this was called Harbor Hill, and it was over in Roslyn, overlooking the harbor. You can't see the water, but it is on the water. And it was built in 1904 designed by Stanford White for Clarence Mackey and his wife, Catherine Dewar was her maiden name. And the other day, I was doing this program over in Seacliff, and the granddaughter walked into the library. She's 101. And I said something, she's not here. Tell me she's not. I said something that was true, but she had a fit. Anyway, so they were unbelievable. So Clarence Mackey, he made his money at copper mines. He owned American Telephone and Telegraph. I mean, he owned everything. And so he built this house to impress. And it's interesting because the driveway, you could have made it up there. It's right off Roslyn Road. The entrance gate is still there. But you could have made it from Roslyn Road up to the main house within 1 mile. But he wanted to impress people. So he told the engineers to zigzag the driveway, loop it around so that it took 5 miles to get to the house. And during parties, they would line it with Japanese land. It's a very clever thing to do, actually. So people would think, oh, we're driving for 2 hours now. We're still not there. It must be a really big estate. But that's how they would, think. So September 24th, this is my tissue, 1924, the Mackeys heard that the Prince of Wales was coming to Long Island to watch a horse show over at the Meadowbrook Club in Jericho. And what I had said the other day was that Catherine Dewar, she had been an opera singer. She's from the Bronx. I had said she was pretentious because she was very gaga over royalty. Everybody was gaga over royalty. If you knew a prince or a baron or a count or a duke, I don't even know what the hell that is. What's duke? What is a count? I think they must have a castle somewhere in Europe. They didn't always necessarily have any money. Well, a prince, we know what a prince is. So the Prince of Wales, the world's most eligible bachelor, was coming to Long Island. And they absolutely flipped out because they had 3 really beautiful daughters. And Catherine was so, royalty. Her jewels, I don't know if I have a picture of her. No, okay, I don't. All right, that's the Legendary Women show. I have a picture of her. She had Queen Victoria's jewels replicated, to a T. There's nothing wrong with that. So she's, gaga over royalty. So they were determined, the Mackeys maybe were hoping that maybe he would take a fancy to one of their daughters and then they'd have royalty in the family. So they decided they were going to invite the Prince of Wales to their house for dinner, and they had an invitation printed up and had their chauffeur deliver it wherever the Prince of Wales was staying. And the invitation said something like, Your Royal Highness, you are cordially invited to our humble abode for dinner with friends and family. This is the humble abode. And I don't know if I'm paraphrasing it. It was something along those lines. So the prince actually RSVP'd. He accepted the invitation for September 24th. And of course, it was white tie and tails. Well, the Mackeys, as you can imagine, went nuts because they were going to impress the Prince of Wales. And I don't know how much time they had. I think they only had about a month. They just went wiggy. And I'm never going to remember everything they did because it's just so over the top. So the first thing they did was they hired electricians or whatever to construct a replica of the American flag that was 150 feet long with red and white flashing lights, and they mounted it on top of the mansard roof, and it's flashing red, white, and blue, and you could see it all the way to Connecticut. And then they had all the food was catered from Delmonico's. It's a very fancy restaurant. They hired Paul Whiteman and his orchestra with the 40-piece orchestra, white tie and tails. They got Enrico Caruso, the great opera star of the time, singing Italian love songs in the ballroom. They had Rudolph Valentino doing the, flamenco, the fandango, on the loggia there. Rudy Valley. Rudy Valley was like considered the Frank Sinatra of that era. But if you ever heard him, he sounds like Alvin the Chipmunk. Did you ever see a movie, Rudy? But he was considered the Frank Sinatra at the time. So what else did they do? Oh, yes. The gardens were replicated from Marie Antoinette's, gardens at Versailles. And with all those little reflecting pools, they filled the reflecting pools with Chanel No. 5. Not maybe 5 gallons added to the pool. Why did they do that? I asked someone who was there. I actually interviewed people who had been at this party, and they said, well, think about it. It would put you in a romantic mood. You're walking in the gardens, you smell Chanel No. 5. It makes you feel really amorous. And then they'd run off behind the hedge grove and get frisky. That was very common. No, that was very common. That's why they built hedge groves, really. I'm serious. And then they had these pyrotechnicians. Everything was lighting, all kinds of beautiful lights in the gardens. At midnight, they had a fireworks display from a barge that went on for 45 minutes. And did I mention that they had 2,000 guests? According to the New York Times, they invited 2,000 people. And there were 2 tents, one in the front, one in the back, huge Ringling Brothers circus size, pink and white stripes. Remember that, because I have a theory about that. So when you sat down at your place setting for dinner, there was on each plate, there was a little robin egg blue box from Tiffany's. And everyone got a little party favor. So the women, when they opened their little box, and it's hard, you can come up and look at it. This is not the real thing, this is a replica. You got a little 24-karat bow, like this, studded with diamonds and rubies and emeralds. So every lady got one of these. And the men got a cigarette lighter or cigarette case with the Prince of Wales, coronet or coat of arms, whatever, studded with little jewels. I have no idea what that cost. 1924. I mean, 24 karat gold. Very nice. Anyway, and the granddaughter had shown me the real thing. When I saw one identical, I got it. So it's right here. If you want to look at it. Oh, right. It's 1924. What's going on in 1924? Prohibition. There are 2,000, almost 2,000 guests at Harbor Hill, and it's illegal to serve alcohol. Oh, yes. So, I'm not going to be able to hear you at all. Do you know what he's saying? I can only hear from 3 feet. What?
It was like a river, and there was a bridge. In one of the earlier pictures, there was like a river, and there was a bridge.
Well, they took advantage of all those docks and piers. It wasn't a bridge. It was a dock. No, so all right. So it's prohibition, and from what I heard, there was no such thing. No party ever went dry. I mean, booze was everywhere. So a week before, Clarence and Catherine got on the phone, and they called every gangster within 100 miles. I have the list of all the gangsters. Meyer Lansky, Dutch Schultz, Waxy Gordon, Legs Diamond. Who am I leaving out? I mean, there were like a whole bunch of them. I can't even remember them all. Probably Great Gatsby, who was really Max Girl, Lucky Luciano. So the biggest gangsters, at Dutch Schultz, of course. And all night long, these gangsters were coming up to the estate, the dock on the water, in speedboats. And of course, the speedboats had special engines so they could outrun the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard could very rarely catch the so-called bad guys. The liquor bill for that one night was $150,000. A bottle of champagne then was $100, and then you had gin and scotch, and the party went on until the next morning, and they had a big breakfast kind of a thing. So I don't know if I got everything that they did that night, but that's enough. You get the idea. It was grand. And I'm convinced that F. Scott Fitzgerald and his wife Zelda, I would swear that they crashed this party. It was very easy to crash parties in those days. Now there's a lot of fancy parties, like the Met Ball. You cannot crash the Met Ball, the security and everything. But back then, I think anyone could just slither through the woods. And I have a reason why I believe they were there. They were known to crash on any given weekend. They would crash about 3 or 4 parties because they were trying to mix with the elite, to be part of that world, and with good reason. He's writing about them. And so I'm sure he had a really grand time. So here they are. This is Fitzgerald and his wife, Zelda, obviously taken in the winter with the fur coat. And there's a lot of books that have been, written about them. So back in Oyster Bay, one of the houses that was kind of a very short distance from where we were living was called Farnsworth. And this had a crazy story. It was a 60-room, kind of a Mediterranean-style house that was abandoned in 1940 when Wallace C. Bird, his plane crashed when he was flying up the Hudson, and he died. And his wife, who'd been a former Ziegfeld girl, she was devastated. Now, you can see the vandalism. All these abandoned houses, this is what everything looked like at the time. It's like dissolving as the rain, is getting in. But when she walked out the door after her husband's funeral, she left everything in the house Aubusson rugs, chandeliers. She took her jewels. She had $8 million in jewels. She left all of her ball gowns, her Paris one-of-a-kind ball gowns. And my sister and I kind of got wind of this. It must have been about 7 or 8 steamer trunks up on the 3rd floor. We knew the house was going to be bulldozed, and wait, jump to, I forget which slide is where. We became cat burglars, basically, because we weren't gonna, my grandmother was a seamstress, and my mom was a seamstress. We knew, beautiful quality clothes, and these gowns some of them were Charles Worth gowns. I have them all. We saved hundreds of them. They're in my house. I loan them out. I just did 2 exhibits recently with the gowns and the little bags and the shoes and things at the Souset Library, and I had a display at the Locust Valley Library. So I do, share them so people can see what they look like. But it's hard to keep track of them all. So we would, go in there, on a horse, and go into the linen closets and take these pillowcases out of the linen closet and stuff the gowns, and then sort of tie them and put them around our neck and then gallop off. It's not easy to do. And our parents didn't know we were doing that because they were very strict religious. They would throw us in jail. But we were saving these beautiful artifacts. I had one of those gowns appraised years ago. It's a Charles Worth gown. It's actually on the back cover of my book, which I forgot to bring. That one gown was worth $20,000. It's all beaded and amazing the way the clothes were made back then. So we were doing God's work, believe me. Somebody recently said, you belong in jail. Really. I never saw any other girls doing this kind of stuff. We'd see boys smashing things, throwing, bricks and breaking windows, but I never saw girls, it was dangerous. Look at this. Things would fall on your head. And so meanwhile, I was frantically trying to show everyone how beautiful they were. These are the Muden ruins. I think they're still there, over in Laddingtown, right off the water. You can't see the water, but it's there. There's, have dozens and dozens of these paintings. And did anyone ever read Nelson DeMille's book, The Gold Coast? I'm told that, according to the New York Times, 60 million people around the world read his book. And he goes on and on about those paintings, the Gold Coast paintings of that woman. He had actually seen these paintings back in the 80s before he wrote the book. I didn't know who he was. I never read his books until after. And he described this one and several others, to a T. So, all right, here is another interesting house. Actually, this is not a mansion. This is a playhouse because it has an indoor tennis court, an indoor pool, and a squash court, and a bowling alley, and all that stuff. How many of you were alive on Halloween night, 1955? Oh, good. I was 12. I remember, well, we lived next door to this place, very close by. There have been a lot of books written about the Woodward murder. 3 books and 3 movies. Not one of them came close to the truth. What really happened that night is one of the most horrific stories, really. We ultimately, after the thing happened, we ended up moving into the house under weird, freaky circumstances. So it was called the Playhouse. It's still there. It's on Berry Hill Road, right across the street from Ole Cassini's old mansion. He was a good friend of mine. So this was built in the early 20s, and Billy Woodward was from a very wealthy banking family that went back, I don't know, maybe 200 years. I think Citibank, I think it was. And he was very proper. His mother was the grande dame of all society, Elsie Woodward. And she was getting nervous because he wasn't married, and in those days you had to get married. And so he went to the Copacabana one night, and he met Anne, well, who became Anne Woodward. I think her maiden name was Crowell. She was from Kansas originally, another farm girl. And she became a radio actress. And this is the front entrance here of the Woodward place. And this is the, typical, there were quite a few of these as your indoor. I had to use a fisheye lens to show how huge this thing was. And the indoor pool. And here, this is Anne Woodward. She was very, very pretty. I actually got to meet her once. So she was a radio actress, when all of radio broadcasting, back in the 30s and 40s, it was all done at Radio City, Rockefeller Plaza. It was at 50 Rock, with a bazillion high Rockefeller building, all radio broadcasting, Amos and Annie, and You're Too Young to Remember all those crazy shows. So she was just one of many actresses who simply read and told, the murder mysteries. And so she met Billy Woodward at the Copacabana one night, and they sort of, hit it off, and they got married very, very quickly. And it was a very volatile kind of not so good marriage, because everybody in Oyster Bay, we would hear rumors. 1 minute she'd have a black eye, or her arm would be in a sling. So things were not really okay. So one night, that's Billy Woodward. I'm going to back up here. Okay, so one night, Halloween night, 1955, the Woodwards were invited to Vikings Cove, a huge estate in Laddingtown, right next door to J.P. Morgan's. And the guest of honor, again, was the Prince of Wales, who had by that time become the King of England. And then he got kicked out of England because he married Wallis Simpson. She was divorced a couple times. So he got kicked out of England, and they weren't dumb. They came to the Gold Coast. We'll live at the Long Island's Gold Coast. We'll live like kings and queens. And then they were right. Everybody took them in. So that's where they were that night, on Halloween night. So they left the party at around 1, got to their, mansion in Oyster Bay, and at 2 in the morning, the neighbors heard 2 gunshots, like from an elephant gun, a very heavy gun. And it was an hour before anybody called the police. Well, what happened that night, everything you heard is a crock. And I understand, I agree, they had to cover everything up. But what happened was he did something so disgusting to her, he almost killed her, and she had it. And she took the elephant gun that they used to use on safari that was in the closet, I guess. And while he was taking a shower, she fired 2 shots, and she completely decapitated him. And the only reason I know is, once we moved in with the police, there's no crime. There's no crime I never heard of crime in Oyster Bay. We never locked our doors. Nobody ever locked their doors. I still don't lock my doors. The police really had nothing to do, and then this happens. So that's where I got this story from. So what happened? What would prompt a woman to do such a thing? Well, it turns out, and I don't know how to put it, because, my mom said you don't discuss unseemly things in the presence of menfolk, but maybe there's a way. So they were arguing, maybe, who knows. And he took a bathroom plunger, with a wooden handle, and he must have cracked it on something. So now it's like a sharp dagger, and he put it in a delicate place, viciously. So she's now hemorrhaging to death. And, I don't know why no one called the police. A lot of people in the house. I mean, every room in that house So finally, Billy Woodward's mother comes flying out from the city, and she was told what to say because they could not have a murder trial, because if it came out what he did to her, it wouldn't look good, for the family name. Plus, they had 2 kids. So she was told to say, oh, I heard a burglar break a window, and I opened the door, and I fired at a shadow, or I heard a sound. Well, you wouldn't fire an elephant gun into a dark hall. Their 2 children were sleeping in the next room. Does that make sense? So, I mean, they had to say that. She would have been acquitted anyway. So there was no murder trial. There was an inquest, and she said what she was told to say, and she was free to, go on with her life until. All right, here's Billy Woodward. There were a lot of comments, inappropriate, saying, well, it's a good thing she didn't shoot the horse. They owned Nashua. You remember Nashua, the greatest horse of all time? Nashua is making millions of dollars winning, I don't know anything about horse racing, the Kentucky Derby, the Preakness. The horse is making a lot of money. And that's Eddie Acaro, the jockey who got him there. And so here you see, Billy Woodward. And, it was just a horrific thing. So years later, I'm sorry, I wouldn't be able to hear you from back here. We could talk after. Years later, maybe 20 years later, Ann Woodward was supposedly on a cruise ship. It could have been a party, I'm not really sure. But she was very social. And she had the misfortune of running into Truman Capote, who's a brilliant writer, no question. Now, I met him a few times. I could not stand him. He had this squeaky voice, and he was very charming. He had a way of winning your confidence. And you heard about the swans and all these beautiful society ladies, like Cece Guest. She was one of the swans, and Babe Paley. These were all elegant women, hostesses on the North Shore, and he beguiled and charmed all of them, and they would share secrets with him. And then he writes a book about it. So Ann Woodward was probably lonely. Maybe she was drinking. She tells Truman Capote what really happened that night, and that hideous, vicious, abusive thing that he did to her. And she tells him, and he puts it in his book, Answered Prayers. And it was excerpted in Esquire magazine, I think in the 70s. And he was such a mean-spirited person. The night before it was going to come out, he sent a messenger to her apartment in the city and left it on her doorstep. And she opened it and she read it. And he left out the part of what her husband had done to her, that horrible violation which almost killed her. She was never quite right after that. He left that part out and made it sound like she was just a vicious killer. And so 10 minutes later, she committed suicide. So he was really a bad guy. Anyway, so here's another picture I dug up somewhere. Now, I don't approve of killing innocent little animals who are living, in Africa or wherever, and I guess that's what rich folks did. But the photograph shows her having just killed a tiger. It's the same gun that she used on her husband. It's very painful to see that because animals, I'm sorry, animals are precious. They don't have a chance. And so after that, she couldn't sell the house. Nobody wanted to buy it. The bullet holes were still in the walls. She shot him in the stall shower, and the bullets were all over, blood right outside the bathroom, master bathroom, wall-to-wall carpeting. And my aunt and uncle actually bought the house for nothing. The property was being broken up. It was 200 acres, and it came on 4 acres, and the rest was kind of developed. So I was a college student at the time, and this was my bedroom when I was there. Now, the reason my bedroom is kind of fancy for a college kid is because everything in it was rescued from a mansion. When they were bulldozing Farnsworth, we just swooped in and rescued all this wonderful stuff. That vanity table was supposedly once owned by Empress Josephine. I still have it. I take very good care of it. It would have been all squished into the ground. And this was their living room. When they were living there, the living room was 100 feet long, 32-foot ceiling. But when we lived there, we couldn't afford to heat it, so there was nothing. There was no furniture at all. One night, we did host a Halloween party, and you had to come as a character, from the Gold Coast. So Newsday made a big fuss over that, because you were playing disco music. So now here, we're almost at the end. You probably know this place. This is the Woolworth Mansion in Glen Cove, Winfield. And it was used constantly for movies. They were filming Mildred Pierce not too long ago with Kate Winslet. I'm not sure what kind of car that is. Maybe the men know what kind of car. Beautiful car. So this is probably, I think, this is the most haunted house anywhere on the East Coast. It's made of marble. And you don't want to live in a marble house. The floors were marble, the walls were marble. Marble, contains like silica, ferric salts, and quartz crystals. These are vibrating, substances, and they retain energy. Psychics work with crystal balls and divining crystals for a reason. It's vibrating. It's got a living like a pulse to it, conversations that took place in this mansion back in the 20s, whenever there's a thunderstorm, because it needs the electricity in the atmosphere to trigger, you'd start to hear conversations in the wall. It's not necessarily ghosts. It's just a natural acoustical phenomena of, that energy will activate, like one of those iron oxide records. It's all vibration. You got a needle on the record, and what's all this sound that's retained in the walls will sometimes play back. But there were quite a few murders and suicides. Woolworth's daughter Edna Woolworth committed suicide. Her daughter was Barbara Hutton, who was married 100 times to crazy people. So some mysterious person, this is all we talk about lately, some mysterious foreigner recently bought this mansion. Does anyone know anything about that? We don't know. We know nothing about him. They said Russian, whatever. And of course, underneath, there's a whole network of interconnecting tunnels, about 500 feet of tunnels, 300 feet from the basement into the carriage house, another one out back, and then there's another mysterious one that I don't want to say too much about it. You have to read my book, Winfield. It's in the library. Fascinating house, but lots of tragedy. And Mr. Woolworth, who grew up in Great Bend, upstate New York, he really believed that he was the reincarnation of Napoleon Bonaparte. He believed it. I don't know where he got that. I mean, we laugh. We should laugh. We don't know. Who knows? I have a theory about it, because up in Great Bend, I never saw it, there was an old estate that was built by Napoleon Bonaparte's brother. I think his brother's name was Joseph, because when Napoleon was banished to, was it Mount St. Helena or something, his brother had planned an elaborate escape by boat or submarine, I don't know. It never worked out. So the brother, in anticipation of this happening, he built this huge castle up in Great Bend. I don't know if it's still there. And Woolworth would drive the farm wagon, whatever, and he would just see the gates of what would have been Napoleon's new house in America. And it'd just be on. He would see this huge castle. So maybe that influenced his thinking. And so throughout his entire life, he obsessed on the fact that he was the reincarnation, of Napoleon. So this is his master bedroom. There's an old picture. And that is actually one of Napoleon Bonaparte's sleigh beds that Woolworth had all the money in the world. He could buy anything he wanted. And he was very into Egyptology and theories about time travel. Really, he was a fascinating man. And the place is still standing miraculously. And this is a recent shot. I have to do a painting of this. To me, this is beauty. You get a house engulfed in vines. Isn't that dramatic? With the marble, the lions, and the caretaker had a drinking problem. So he didn't do a very good job cutting back the weeds. So, all right, we're at the end. I think it's the last house. All right, so getting back to Gatsby. So it's now 1972. I got a call from David Merrick, who I didn't know who he was. I knew he was famous, but I didn't know why. And you can't say that over the phone. I had to pretend I knew who he was. So he called up, and I was doing locations for the movie industry, and he said, we need to find the Gatsby Mansion. We're going to make a movie of Fitzgerald's book, and it's going to star Robert Redford. Well, I heard that, and I nearly dropped dead. I literally fell on the floor because Robert Redford had just starred with Paul Newman, another one, in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and we were all still drooling. Like, Robert Redford. So I knew there was nothing left that would pass as the Gatsby Mansion. Really, I thought maybe the Woolworth Mansion, maybe, but it had to have a sweeping lawn going down to the Sound, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing that even came close. So I don't want to say that. So for 2 weeks, we were in his limousine. Somebody told me who he was. Merrick. He was a big Broadway producer, but now he was doing movies. We were in the car with Francis Ford Coppola, who was writing the screenplay for this after winning 1 million Oscars, for The Godfather, which part of it was shot, here on Long Island. He's that guy is Coppola, absolutely brilliant. So he's in the car, and Dean Tavaloris is doing all the designing of everything. And so we're driving around for 2 weeks, and nothing panned out. And of course, I felt guilty. I mean, it wasn't my fault, but I felt so bad that I didn't even send them a bill for my time. And I should have preserved the mansion. So a year went by, and if you ever want to know what's going on in the movie business, or if you want to ever be an extra in a movie, anybody can be in a movie, you just, every week you read either Billboard or Variety, it's in the library, and they tell you what's going on. There's going to be a casting call, you have to have a little Polaroid or a picture of yourself, or maybe you have a talented dog that balances, jellyfish on its nose, just anything weird that they will ask for. So I happened to see it, and it said that David Merrick finally found the perfect Gatsby Mansion, and he did. Much better than anything we had. Here's... I'll just pause a moment. So there's Mr. Red. And by the way, he's one of the nicest people very friendly and talked to everybody. And there is the yellow Rolls Royce that Fitzgerald managed to buy. And so this is the house. It's called Rose Cliff. I forget who built it, some wealthy person. It's right on Belmont Avenue. It was so perfect. It had the big ballroom and it had a sweeping lawn going out to the Atlantic Ocean, which at night looks just like the Long Island Sound. And they built the dock and they put the green light. And so I'm reading this and I never throw anything out. So I called David Merrick and I said, oh, hi. He did not remember who I was. We spent 2 weeks scouting. And I said, I never sent you a bill because I couldn't find what you needed. I said, but you think you could give me a little part, in your movie? And he was a very impatient man, and he says, well, can you do the Charleston? And I said, I'm the Charleston champion of Long Island. Everybody, big lie, big fat lie. But I think what really did it, I said, I have hundreds of dresses from that era, the real thing, the 1920 flapper gowns that belong to all these society ladies, and I have them in my house. I'll loan you a few, just maybe a dozen. So that, I think, really, did it. So I threw them all in the car and went up to Newport, Rhode Island. And that's me 100 years ago. That's 51 years ago. Now, this is one of the gowns. And the tiara, the little rhinestone tiara with the feathered, we took all the accessories that went with these things. So this is a publicity shot. So Newsday puts this picture on the cover and says, local girl stars in Gatsby movie. And if you see the movie, even when my mother saw it, I'm like, it's like I was just one of 200. And I had to take lessons. I had to go to Arthur Murray's and learn the Charleston real quick. Oh my God, it was so embarrassing. And so the first thing, when you're on a movie with famous folk, the first thing they say, the director will say, if we catch anyone, any of you extras with a camera, you will never work in the movie business again. Well, I had no intentions, I'm not an actress, but I snuck my Nikon onto the ostrich feathered fan. And then during a break, I just crept up to Mia Farrow and Redford as Bruce Stern, and then Lois Childs, who played the cheating, a golf champion. And they didn't care, because if I didn't, I wouldn't have pictures to show you. And so this is our last shot. This is why I think that Fitzgerald and his wife crashed the Clarence Mackey party, because look at the tent. You got 2 pink and white tents. You have Paul Whiteman and his 40-piece orchestra. This is just an actor who looks like Paul Whiteman. And these dresses are a lot of the dresses that we stole from the old bulldozed mansions. And even those torchères were at at Harbor Hill. So that is our program on Gatsby's Long Island.